Hi there, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing today?
Good. How about you?
Oh, not too bad. Always happy it's a Friday each day and get another chance to have another new guest onto my live stream. So appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, thank you.
hmm Yeah, so I know we've kind of interacted in circles in the Northwest and everything, and both have had ties either through work or colleagues through SkyPoint Cloud and everything. But I'd love for a chance to give yourself an opportunity to give a little introduction about yourself, kind of who you are, where you've come from, and um, kind of what your role is within like the Power BI community.
Yeah, so I'm based in Portland. I do a little bit of everything in Microsoft 365, I would say. Power BI is my favorite. That's why I'm here. But I do have a background in SharePoint and I do some stuff with Power Automate, so on and so forth. So this is a pretty good topic for me generally. Just some background on how I got into this space. Before Power BI came out, I had no background in data whatsoever. I had a totally unrelated degree. So maybe I can spend a couple of minutes kind of going over how I got into this space in case anybody else is in that
Oh,
same boat.
that'd be great.
Yeah, so essentially I started out in SharePoint, not necessarily because it's my favorite, but because nobody else wants to do it. So it's a really great way to get your foot in the door in technology. You look like you were about to say something. Did you have a...
No, 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 not
No,
at all. I'm
okay.
just listening.
Okay, yeah. So I did SharePoint administration for a number of years, and when Power BI came out, I was like, oh my gosh, this is pretty much the most awesome thing. So I just basically spent more time trying to go that way. It took me a number of years, so I'm not going to say it was a fast process, but basically just volunteering to do that work. And it was nice that I had the space to do that, right? So if you're in a space where you are barely able to complete your work in any given day, then that's
Mhm.
not as easy of a thing to do. But I was lucky to have a really great employer at the time that let me and even helped me make that transition. So that was really amazing. But I can say just from a general perspective, the thing that I think is the most helpful as far as getting interviews in this space, if you don't have a lot of experience in it, is making a portfolio. And spend some time on it, make it a good portfolio. It'll drastically increase your interview rate at the very least, so you can at least make your case. The other thing that helps, I got the certification, which I think was useful for somebody that doesn't have a lot of background in the space. Just something that both that the certification and the portfolio, I think, really can demonstrate that you were able to do the work you're trying to get into, if that
Agreed.
makes sense. But yeah, I got a position on the reporting team that popped up in my organization at the time after a few years of kind of mucking my way through it. And I stayed there for quite a while. So it's kind of rest is history at that point. But
And I mean, anything that can kind of speak for you without needing to speak is something good to have, right? Like whether or not
mhm.
it's the Power BI certification. I've had a couple of people actually ask me about the Azure Enterprise Data Analyst certification. I would say if you don't have that already, I would hold off on getting that just because that's probably going to change a lot in the next 12 months just due to Fabric. So many of the enterprise features that used to be in the Azure will now kind of be moving into Fabric. Just as a quick aside to that, but I agree. Just having those get your foot in the door. but then also having things that tangible things for people to look at, like actual files that you built maybe off of demo data, or if you have a really great thing that you built for a company or a client, and getting permission to like, hey, if I like replace this data set and obfuscate the data to have like fake data in there, but still have all the work that went into the measures and everything else, can I, is that okay if I have a version of this to have as a show of my work? And
Hmm.
I've done that a few times as well. Uh, and if you're more on the reporting layer, actually having a couple of like things on a web page that you can go to where you can maybe look at some of the like a marquee of maybe some of the report pages that you've built, or some even just some embedded reports. All of that goes a long way, I think, to helping you get that buy-in from someone to want to like maybe have a further conversation with you.
Yeah, yeah, and the developer tenants for Microsoft 365 are free, so you can. It does require a worker school account to sign up for, but I've had one for many years now, and it's been really helpful for me, just as a place to play around too, not even just for the portfolio. But what you do is you just publish your report to the web there, and then you can use that link in your resume.
Exactly. I'm just reading some of the chat right now. It's, um, so I do think that overall, it's there are a lot of people are really wanting to definitely move into an analytics career, and I think, as you already mentioned, you had people that were your advocates to a degree. I think it does go honestly a long way when you have a boss or anybody else is willing to give you a few hours of your time while you're working to actually explore other avenues. I mean, and overall, like I've seen nearly universally, it benefits the company when you give people opportunity to learn new skills, but it's not always necessarily available, and that can often be, I know, a major roadblock for individuals if they're not given permission, or even if they have permission, if they're not given time to take a few hours out of the week to like, hey, this is going to be my learn time, and I'm not going to do anything else on this 2 hours a week that I have blocked off my calendar.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Mhm. Excellent. But considering Power BI and also I think we've talked about a couple of other Microsoft products as well, like SharePoint and everything else. I think this is going to be an interesting topic today. I know we're going to talk about the cohesiveness and how everything kind of plays together as part of a larger family, which I do
Hmm.
think is one major benefit of the Microsoft platform. Is you get a tool that works both for and to and with any of the other products very, very well as far as integrations, both from a publishing and reporting perspective and an ingestion and consumption perspective. So I think there's lots of opportunities to see that better together in the title, how these tools play together. So
Yeah.
um, from the topic perspective, where would you like to start some of these conversations?
Yeah, so the inspiration for this topic really was
Mm-hmm.
I got to go to the M365 conference in Vegas this May, and the keynote had this really awesome slide. And I wish I could have gotten it for this presentation, but it doesn't look like they've put it up on the internet anywhere. They had all of the Microsoft 365 logos for all the different products in a big circle around the 365 logo, and um, there was a really strong message of better together just generally throughout the conference, but they didn't have any sessions on that topic, and they didn't have a lot of examples of what that looked like in real life. So I was thinking it would be good to just, throw some stuff out there, get some ideas going, you know what I mean? So I'm going to present a few today, but if anybody has anything that they've done with the better together concept that they want to share, that would be super awesome.
Yeah, drop those into the chat below. But excellent, yeah. Whenever you're ready, I can flip over to some of those slides and we can get started.
All right, sounds good.
Beautiful. There you are.
So oftentimes when people think of using Power BI together with the other Power Platform apps, the first thing that kind of leaps to mind is the two visuals, so like the Power Automate visual and the Power Apps visual. But there's a whole lot else that you can do with it, and I don't feel like those two are necessarily, for me, the main focus. So I want to go through some of those, but first, let's talk about why you would want to do that in the first place. So number one, it's fun. I feel like people who use Power BI as in their career generally like it, which is actually kind of a rare thing in the grand scheme of things. Not for Power BI specifically, but just generally enjoying your job and enjoying the tools that you use. So it's very likely that if you like Power BI, that you will potentially like other Microsoft 365 apps. If you haven't tried them, it's worth checking them out. Number two, diversification. So this is good for your career generally. It's also just good for a change of pace every once in a while. So keeping things interesting, right? On top of that, the job market being what it is right now, I feel like just with the market generally, and with the AI scare of everybody scared that the AI is going to take their jobs, diversification doesn't hurt. It may or may
Breadth
not
versus
help, but it
depth,
won't
right?
hurt. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Number three, unblock yourself. So Microsoft, I feel like, is really pushing the Power Platform and Microsoft 365 generally as being a tool to do this. So something where you are empowered to fix things without having to wait for IT or ask somebody else. It's also kind of a right tool, right job thing, because
Yep.
people oftentimes get stuck trying to do something with one specific tool because that's the tool that they know, and they don't necessarily, they aren't aware that there's other things out there that are like literally meant to do the thing that they're trying to do with a different tool. So there's that. And then also it's probably already something that is in the license package that you're using. So if you've got a basic Microsoft 365 license bundle, most of these things are going to be included in that. So the majority of what we're going to talk about today doesn't require premium or anything kind of special licensing. And I just want to just touch on Copilot. So Copilot is like the big buzz thing lately, right? So they just did an announcement last week about the pricing for Copilot, and it's coming sometime. Nobody really knows when. If somebody does know when, let me know, because I haven't heard an actual date or anything like that. But the messaging around Copilot is including this language of better together. So Copilot is theoretically going to be a tool that helps us connect all of the things, where we don't necessarily have to be experts in everything in order to use them together. So I'm hoping that it ends up delivering on that promise. Usually when it first comes out, I'm kind of expecting to be a little bit rough in places, and it is the things that are in preview right now are
the DAX Copilot.
I haven't tried that one yet, honestly. I really need to.
Don't need to. Hopefully, the anybody on that development team, like, it's just. I even had a client who wasn't convinced, like, because there's a button if you go to do the measure suggestion in the new version, it has a Copilot option where you can type in a question, and I think I just did give me a rolling 15 days per account, by month and year, and it produced a script that said, oh yeah, this will work. You click it, and it immediately just returns nothing. It doesn't work with the calendar table. And then I typed in a bunch of other questions. It just didn't even know how to, I think I asked an average or something, and it just couldn't understand it. It was bad. So I'm very excited for a lot of this stuff to come out, but I also do like the new title that's being thrown around the internet, which is prompt engineer. I think is a new job title that you're not going to know how to code. You need to know basically just your assistant is the co-pilot. You need to know how to ask the assistant the right questions, and it does the rest of the work for you. So your job is now a prompt engineer.
Yeah. So I've tried out the Copilot for Power Automate and the one for Power Apps. They had pretty much the same experience that you're describing, where it totally was completely off in what it was trying to do for me. But I did try the Copilot assisted Power Virtual Agent, and that one actually did what I wanted it to do. It was really limited on how much text it would learn from, which is kind of a problem. I couldn't get it to take more than 1 page worth of text to use in its responses, but it did correctly answer the questions that I gave it. So that was nice.
Yeah, it's a lot of those little things that are great ideas that I think by the time GPT-5 is integrated will be much better.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so on to our tools. Power Automate Desktop. This is, you have to realize that Power Automate Cloud and Power Automate Desktop are two very different things. Power Automate Desktop is essentially you're making a series of steps to tell your computer to do things. So you can have it click on things, you can have it open things, you can have it click menu options. The menu options, when you're clicking buttons in there, it works a lot better with Microsoft products, obviously, because it's got more context for that. But it's really good for web scraping. And web scraping is something that a lot of people try and do with Power BI to more or less success. So you really start hitting a wall with Power BI when you're using or trying to scrape a website that is behind authentication or that has dynamic URLs or dynamic IDs on the tables, that kind of thing. Or any kind of looping through pages is pretty complicated, especially if they're something that's loaded on the page and not in the URL. So Power Automate Desktop can do all of those things because it can physically like click on things in your browser and go like click the next page button and get stuff on the next page. It can also, if you're running it on PDFs, you can use regular expressions, which are basically like pattern recognition for text files. So you can, like a common use case for a regular expression is like to find and scrape phone numbers, say, where the pattern isn't always exactly the same every time. Like sometimes people use parentheses, sometimes they use dashes, that kind of thing. The regular expressions is something that I don't think that you can do in Power BI alone. Like you could potentially maybe use like the Python data connection to do that and write Python for it, but I don't think that there's a way to do it in Power BI natively.
So would this be for parsing PDFs or?
Yeah, any text,
So
but it can do PDFs.
you do. Yeah, you do have a PDF and then a fetch from folder. So in theory, they're like, I mean, anywhere there's Power Query, basically, regardless of if it's in Power BI, it's in a few places in Azure and Fabric now with like data flows, but Power Query in general can definitely do the scraping and just stick it somewhere inside of the Dataverse.
But the thing is it doesn't have the regular expressions bit. So if you're trying to say get the text that comes after this value, like say get the account name out of this file, and you're trying to run it on a whole folder, that may be more or less complicated if there's not something around it to properly grab, you know what I mean? So
true.
And then Power Automate Desktop is really good at taking whatever you're scraping and sending it to Excel or SQL. So as far as I know, the SQL connector for Power Automate Desktop isn't premium. It doesn't have the little premium gem icon like it does for Power Automate Cloud, probably because it's looking at local SQL is my guess. Or not local, but on-premise. And Power Automate Desktop is, I want to say, mostly free because as long as you're willing to have a human push the start button, it counts as an attended flow, and attended flows don't trigger additional licensing. So if you want to schedule it, it will cost additional. But if you're willing to push the button and let it run on your computer and not touch your computer while it's running, then it's basically free. You'd usually just run it overnight, something like that, when you're not using your computer.
Exactly.
And it can also take screenshots, which is pretty cool. So what I use this for mostly is when I'm trying to debug it and it runs for 2 hours and then fails on something. What you can do is have it take a screenshot when it fails so that you can tell exactly what happened or what page it was on or what it was doing when it failed. But I've seen people have kind of cool ideas with using this, like around video game testing and that kind of thing. I don't know how successful that is, but it's a cool idea. And just a reminder to check the terms of service on any website before you scrape it, because some websites will have, legal ramifications for doing that kind of thing. So if they say don't do it, don't do it. But generally, it's a fun time. Anders Jensen and Learning Technologies are really good sources of information on this. I'm planning to make a few tutorials myself, but they have like full channels with all kinds of stuff going on already. So Anders Jensen in particular just posted one on best practices with this tool. It's pretty good. It's like 2 hours long. It's very, very detailed. All right, Power Automate Cloud.
And as
So
you're going through these, I just want to do a quick mention to the people in the chat that any of the related links that she'll be mentioning will be in the description below in the YouTube video here. So you'll have access to all of those additional resources.
cool. Yeah, I've done tutorials for a few of these things, but not for all of them. I'm kind of going all in on the content creation very shortly here,
Yep.
so there will be quite a bit more coming. So Power Automate Cloud has an option to query a Power BI data set. So this is something that's published to the service. You can query that data set. And the cool thing about that is you can basically then do whatever you want with that data that you've queried. So you can embed it in an email, in an HTML table, you can send it to Teams, you can send an email, and do alerts on that, because as we all know, the alerts in Power BI are very limited right now. So like you can set an alert on a dashboard tile, but it's got to be greater than or less than a certain value. Use all kinds of, I don't think that I think they trigger on the refresh of the data set. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but they're not an instant trigger kind of thing. But this just gives you more control over what you're doing with that query and with your alerts. And the trick that I've found for this query a data set is if you don't want to write the DAX for it, you can use there's an optimizer tool in Power BI where you can basically just set up a visual that has exactly the data that you want to query, and then just copy the DAX from the optimizer tool, and then just paste it right into Power Automate, and it uses that. So you don't have to be able to write the DAX for it necessarily. Something else that you can use this for is snapshotting data. So obviously, if you've got a data engineering team and people that are doing the SQL bit of it, it's better to do it in SQL. But if for whatever reason you don't have that, or you don't have the resources for that, Power Automate can save snapshots of either SQL data, which would be premium because the SQL connection is a premium one, or just querying your data set. The querying the data set is not premium, so that would be included in normal licensing. What I like to do for that is just save it as a CSV to SharePoint, because you can then use the SharePoint folder connector to just grab everything in there. So save a CSV on a schedule with the date in the name of the file, and then just grab that whole folder of data. So the Power Automate visual in Power BI, it's as it is right now, I don't feel like it is super amazing. So how it works is you put it in your data model, you connect it, and then when you push the button, it can run a flow. And that's cool and all, but the problem that I have with it is that when you click the button, there's no indication of what it's doing or whether or not it was successful. And there's no, are you sure you want to do this option? So what I would really like to see is like a pop-up that says, do you want to do this action, or whatever the name of the flow is, because people that are clicking the button, unless you provide them a lot of context, might not know exactly what the button does, and they might not know that it's run successfully after they've clicked it. So they might just keep clicking it, you know what I mean? So
you could almost use, like, you could hack it and do bookmarking, where you could have the button pops up a window, basically unhides a window, which is would you like to run this?
Yeah,
And that's just it's either the Power Automate button, or just, you can also run it from any URL. So you can just also have a button with a URL for it. But the second button is the actual clickable one to prevent accidental clicks. You're still not going to know if it ran successfully unless you had some kind of streaming data kind of coming back into another visual, but you could at least have a two-factor prompt option to prevent those accidental triggers by having a secondary button pop up.
You shouldn't have to do that, I guess.
I agree, but like, my immediate thing is, every time there's a problem, what's the solution that can be built until Microsoft does it properly. But yeah, I definitely can see a way to prevent those fat finger triggers when somebody just clicks it out of curiosity, and then you run the flow when you don't want to.
Yeah, and Miguel Myers did say that they're planning on doing work on this eventually, but he didn't commit to any kind of date around that. So someday it'll probably be better. And then just other things that you can do with the data connectors. There's something like 1,000 data connectors in Power Automate Cloud, so you can get it to grab data from APIs, that kind of thing. I wouldn't use it on super large data sets. Like it's not, you'll run into issues with that just because the amount of resources that it can use is limited and it's kind of slow. But you can use it to get Microsoft 365 profile data as well as planner data. So what I really would like is for there to be a planner connector in Power BI, but there's not right now. So if you want to get, I think it would be really cool if they had that and then had like actually put work into the Gantt visual. There's a Microsoft Gantt visual, but it's like, I feel like it hasn't been updated since Power BI came out, and it's very, has issues. So if they could update those two things, you could do some really cool stuff with like task management, visualization, that kind of thing in Power BI. So I'm hopeful that that happens someday. And the Graph API. So there's all kinds of cool stuff in the Graph API that you can get with Power Automate.
Oh, interesting. The because I just had a client recently that was talking about trying to get their latest pictures, I think, into Power BI, and they were having trouble with like it was pulling previous versions of like a company photo rather than the current one, using some other stuff. And I think a the Microsoft support individual told them they should look at pursuing the Graph API as like an option to get the proper like base64 code that would didn't render in Power BI as an image.
Yeah. The other place that you can get the image, I haven't, I actually have a slide on this later, but the SharePoint connectors, if you use people columns in SharePoint, that's available in Power BI. So you can get profiles that way if you have everybody or the people that you need in a SharePoint list or something.
Okay.
So that's actually this next slide. So Power BI and SharePoint lists. If you're not familiar with SharePoint lists, they're basically a data table with a form on the front end. So they're, in my opinion, a very useful replacement for Excel files where you have people that need to go in and update the data in the Excel file. Primarily because, so number one, data validation. You can do data validation in Excel, but almost nobody does in my experience. So especially when you're dealing with other people's Excel files, they're probably not going to be using data validation on there. So just to keep the data quality higher. The people fields in SharePoint are super awesome. So essentially, you've got, just like any kind of data system, you've got your different field types, right? So people field type is a lookup to the Microsoft 365 user profile. So people start typing in the box, it pops up the name of the person, you click on it, and then that person's profile is also attached to that. So when you go into Power BI, you can expand that people field and get out their job title, their email address, their picture, and their department. And that's assuming that your profile is actually filled in, because that's not always a valid assumption, but it's very cool.
Yep.
This would be much better than, say, having people type in the email address in Excel, because, as you know, that is prone to issues.
Excel's not a database, so
Yeah.
don't use it as a data entry if
Right.
possible.
And neither is a SharePoint list, I have to say. So SharePoint lists are really good for smaller amounts of data. They start struggling a little bit at 5,000 rows. Like you can, there's a thing in SharePoint lists called the list view threshold. Basically, if your view returns more than 5,000 records, it causes all kinds of problems. You can make filtered views so that each of your views only has 5,000 on it, kind of get around that. But it's got issues. Power BI can still pull all of that data, even if you've got like 100,000 rows in the list. Power BI can get all of that, assuming you're using the V1 connector. The V2 connector is limited to 5,000. But it's kind of a slow thing if you've got that much data too, and you're trying to pull it from SharePoint. There's ways around that, and people have all kinds of different creative solutions to this, but there's people on both sides. Like you'll see people making tutorial like content saying like Power BI is a relational database, and then you have other people that are like Power BI is not a relational database. So there's people of the opinion on both sides of that argument. So the other kind of cool thing you can do, and I'm going to show this actually, I've got this PBIX file here. And what you can do with the conditional formatting in Power BI, this is basically, this is a data connection to a SharePoint list. And this is like demo content. It's basically like a requests list. So requests, you've got it in a table. You can use conditional formatting to make a hyperlink directly to the item in SharePoint. So when I click on this, it opens in a browser that I'm not logged in. Let me use my other browser. This one. All right, this one. So I click on this and it opens in SharePoint. So people can go in and modify this and save it. And the data will be reflected in Power BI when it is refreshed. So you can't do direct query on SharePoint lists, so don't expect it to update right away, but it will update on refresh. And the other thing that I prefer SharePoint for over Excel is the permission controls on it. So the problem with Excel is that people can edit whatever part of it they want. So they can change the column names, which will break your Power BI connection. They can do all kinds of things to break that connection, to mess things up. In SharePoint, what you can do with a SharePoint list is there's two different levels of edit access, basically. There's contribute and there's edit. And what contribute does is it lets them submit the form and edit items with the form. And that does not allow them to change column titles or list settings or the list name or anything like that. And then there's edit access, and edit access does let you do those things. So you basically just set the permissions on it such that people can break stuff as they're updating the data, and that's pretty useful. So some use cases that I really like SharePoint lists for are anything where you're trying to set goals and you don't have a better system to do this in. So particularly with like sales goals, what you can do is, have a sales goal for each person using a people column that's got a lookup to their actual Microsoft 365 record, and then set a goal for them in there. And then Power BI just connect that to your actual sales data, right? So you have your goal to actual, and nice little chart, and it's cool. So that's a good way.
That just thinking about people and goals just has me pining for like role level security to come to metrics and goals at some point. I know it's on the roadmap, but it's not there yet, and I just that immediately just had me think of like, oh, that'd be so nice if our actual goals could have a way where everybody could log into the same goal and see different cuts of the data automatically.
Yeah, and if you've seen, there's a new tool for goals in Microsoft 365, Viva something. It's one of the Viva apps. I forget which one.
And it plugs into them, right?
Yeah, you can plug it into the Power BI data set. Yeah. I think it's an additional licensing thing. So like there's certain Viva apps that are included and ones that aren't. I think it's not, but it'll be interesting to see.
Yep, Viva Goals is the name of it.
Yeah, that one. All right, so SharePoint libraries. SharePoint libraries are the super easy version control for your PBIX files. So what I like to do is make one document library and put all of our team PBIX files in it with one folder per workspace. So that kind of keeps things organized. And then what you can do is sync that library with the sync button. I have it right here. So you just sync that down to your computer. And then you've got a local folder where you can create and modify your PBIX files, where every time you save and quit on the file, it creates a new version in the version history. And there is a way to do version comments with this too. It's a little bit more involved, like it's not super user friendly, but you can do version comments. And where that shows up is, let me show you real quick. Got an example here. So you want to go into the actual document library to get this menu option. If you're on a page, it doesn't appear in the web part version of the context menu. So it's not in here. You got to go into the document library. And then this three-dot menu, just go to version history. So you can see this one's got one with a version comment on it. You can download these. So if you just click the date, it'll download that PBIX version, whatever it was like at that point in time. You can also restore these with this little arrow here. So restore will create a new version using that version history item.
Curiously, have you used the that new feature in OneDrive SharePoint that's you can open open the PBX directly in browser, but it just opens it up in its own like built-in embedded portal.
I tried it very briefly, but I always have to download it to edit it anyways, right? The
I have a client that literally I'm in the middle of a migration on this, but right now they have a Power App that has a link that opens that PBX directly inside of a SharePoint, and they have like hundreds of versions of this PBX that gets snapshotted every day, and it opens it into there. And it's like we need to make this better. It's like, so, well, yeah, we're gonna go to an app in a URL with filter parameters, and we are going to improve upon this. But they're leveraging the feature in a very interesting way that works. But it's like we need to simplify this. But it was the first time I saw that in action. But yeah, I think it's like one of those double-edged swords. You give somebody a feature, people are going to find ways to abuse the feature. And I think making it easier to open a file online for Power BI, like it's nice, but then I think people are going to try to use that to circumvent having to publish the report. And then you have to have that poor analyst who is now refreshing it every day because you can't schedule a refresh for a PBX file sitting in SharePoint.
Well, I mean, so this kind of occurred to me the other day, but it's possible that you could use Power Automate Desktop to refresh the PBX files. I wouldn't. This probably gets you in licensing trouble land, but
well, this might date me a little bit, but I don't know if you remember back far enough where SharePoint, when Power Pivot first came out, you could actually publish an Excel file with a Power Pivot model into it, and there was a way in SharePoint to schedule that file to refresh, and it actually would refresh the it would refresh the model.
That's cool. So I didn't try that.
The first scheduled refresh that existed for like the tabular Verta Pack engine was in Power Pivot, where you could publish it to SharePoint or put it into a SharePoint library, and then you could schedule it there, and it would refresh, with the credentials basically on whatever like machine that it was installed on. But that was the first automated refresh that you had, and eventually, obviously, that went away. So you could technically refresh a Verta package at one point in SharePoint.
That's cool. All right. So Excel files, if you're dealing with a lot of Excel files, if you put those Excel files in SharePoint instead of on your local computer, then you don't need a gateway to schedule the refresh on it. So that's useful. I've got a video out there. I can't remember if I gave you this link or not, but I've got a video on my channel on how to change the path from local to SharePoint if you've already got it local and you want to move it for both the folder and the single file connectors. And the new developments happening, that's what Reed was alluding to with the opening the files in SharePoint. But there's also, you can share PBX files from local to people in Microsoft 365 now. Haven't used that much yet, but new things are happening.
Well, we have all the amazing new Git integrations that are coming out, which are like the upgraded version. The one thing that kind of bugs me on how SaaS OneDrive has become is, I don't do that much SharePoint site building and all that, but the ability to create a proper SharePoint site that has the check-in and check-out feature is still there, but it's harder to flip that on, and on most standard, if you create a Teams folder, it's not immediately exposed, and I wish that was just on by default. You never have to touch it, but if you try to open a document, this is locked by Steven because he's working on it or something. So it does help to not get those conflict copies as much when you're working in those folders. So I do wish that they just simply on any enterprise or business version of Teams or of OneDrive or SharePoint, I wish that check-in and check-out feature was just enabled by default, because then you also get that comment history. Every time you check in, add a note, and you can get more detail on what each of those versions was.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's use cases for both. The co-authoring thing is really what I think they've turned it off by default for, so that you can have multiple people editing a file simultaneously, because if you've got it checked out, only one person can edit at a time, right? So there's times for both.
And I have actually a great question on this syncing thing. So Daryl Lynch has a bit of confusion. So if you upload into Power BI from SharePoint, would the PBX change be included when the data set is next refresh? The data set refresh will also grab the PBX reports.
I'm not sure what that question is asking, but the version history in SharePoint is going to be whatever the file state was when you quit the file. So when you save and quit, it's going to be there. If you refresh it later, SharePoint isn't going to know that until you've saved the file and saved a new version necessarily.
And the workspace to the file sync, and it's honestly, it's been a couple of years since I've done that because I usually just maintain them separately in a Git repository. But my understanding is it's only fetching the changes to the report.layout and the schema from the data set. Like when, because you can get data in a workspace and grab it from SharePoint, and the file stays synced between the two of them within a Power BI workspace. I had a video I did on it a few years ago, but it's not refreshing the data in the service and overriding that file. It's simply grabbing chain report and model layer changes from the file every time you save it. So if you add a new measure, your workspace data set will get that new measure. But it's not migrating or moving the data between your Power BI workspace and the file sitting in SharePoint.
Okay. I don't usually use the workspace version. I just sync the folder in SharePoint and then just pretend it's a local folder, honestly. So
that's one thing of just syncing with your computer. This specifically is a Power BI workspace to SharePoint auto sync feature that they were referring to.
Yeah,
because if you're in a workspace, you click get data, you can navigate to a SharePoint folder. And then if you grab the report from there, it adds it to that, but then changes to that report layout or the model layout file inside of the PBX, auto syncs with the workspace. You can just simply open the file from desktop. You don't have to publish it. It automatically will sync in the next 5 minutes for you.
That's cool.
Yeah. But it only syncs changes to the design of the model and the report, not the actual rows of data itself.
Okay, cool. Yeah. All right, so next up is the embed in SharePoint. So there's a web part in SharePoint that it's super duper easy to use. So basically all you do is edit the page, click the little plus icon, add the Power BI web part, and paste in a link to your Power BI report. I've got a demo of this one because I think it's cool. So what you usually see with this is people embedding a full-size report in SharePoint, so like the big one with all the tabs. But what you can also do is basically just make your canvas smaller in Power BI, and then just expand the visual to be like just 1 or 2 visuals, and to try and make it more of like a little widget versus an entire embedded report. And the cool thing about these is that they're still interactive. So you still get the tooltips, you still get the, I don't have 2 visuals here to show this, but you still get the cross filtering between the visuals. So it's basically the exact same experience you get in the web app, just embedded in a page. So that's super fun and easy to do. And Microsoft Forms. So I've got a QR code on here. If anybody wants to submit this Microsoft Forms, maybe we can go at the end and see what the results were. Microsoft Forms is super lightweight and easy to set up, and it's really good for surveys, quizzes, and anytime you need somebody who is outside of your organization to submit a form. Is not good when you're trying to make changes to any of that information. So if you're trying to make like a request list or something like that, where you're managing requests and updating the status and that kind of thing, it's not good for that, because you can't edit these things once you've submitted them, right? I mean, you could edit the Excel file, but then you're editing an Excel file. And so I like SharePoint lists for request management generally, by the way, for small scale things anyways. They work pretty well for that. Because you can set up flows on them, right?
Yeah, and it's anything that's coming out of these, I try to avoid just having it thrown into an Excel file, which is the default. But easy options to use Automate to spit them into a SharePoint list is my absolute way to go as well.
Yeah, and these the Microsoft Forms, if you create it in a Microsoft 365 group, it will automatically sync to an Excel file that you can connect to in Power BI. So theoretically speaking, nobody should be editing the Excel file, but I mean, it's it's an Excel, right? So you don't have any kind of records at that point. It's just a big table. The other thing that you can do with forms is there's a toggle in there to capture the submitter's email address. So oftentimes what you see when people make forms or surveys of any kind is they'll add a field that is, what is your name? And it's really better to get the email address, and it's better to not have them type the email address. So in this case, you can just check a box to capture that, and that makes things a lot easier for you. The one thing that Forms doesn't have that I wish I would have is the ability to use URL parameters with it, like to send specific links that are preset a certain way for different groups. You can do that in Power Apps though, so it's just quite a bit more of a heavy lift to set up.
That's fair. Okay.
So Power BI and Power Apps, this is the one people kind of traditionally think of when you think about using Power Platform with Power BI. So the one that's thrown around a lot is the concept of write back. So people inside of your Power BI report can modify the content in the report and have it reflected back in the report. And if you use direct query for this, that update will happen instantly. The thing is that direct query, anything that supports direct query is probably going to be a premium connector. So there'll be, the way Power Apps licensing works is essentially anybody interacting with the app. If you trigger premium, everybody needs premium. So it can get a little bit expensive if you trigger the premium on Power Apps, but it is an option if you want that. And embedding. So you can embed Power Apps in a Power BI report, but you can also go in the other direction. So you can embed a Power BI report in a Power App. And this works in Dynamics too. So Dynamics has dashboards that you can embed Power BI reports on. And I feel like this is a space that really doesn't have a lot of Power BI native people working in right now. So it's a good niche to get into if you're looking for one that is less competitive. The Power BI reports I've seen embedded in Dynamics, none of them have looked like somebody who does Power BI for their career made. So
Yeah.
yeah, as far as tutorials on this, there's a lot of these out there in the world already. So Reza's got one, GuyanaCube has one, Boss has one. There's a bunch of those out there if that's interesting to you. And Power Pages. So Power Pages is a public website that is hosted in your Power BI tenant. And the main places you'll see this with Power BI is using it as the place that's hosting your, not hosting, but the place that your users are interacting with your Power BI embedded applications. So Power Pages lets you, it lets you set up your own authentication. So you don't have to use the Microsoft user authentication. You can use other authentication types for your row level security there, and that's cool. The other thing you can do with this is you can set up forms in the Power Pages site, and any of that form data that's collected gets sent to Dataverse. And Dataverse is a thing that's really easy to connect to in Power BI. So it's a good way to kind of close the loop without having to set up a bunch of ETL integrations, that kind of thing.
They got a big front and center button right there at the top.
Yeah. So Power Pages is, it's not free. It doesn't come with your license package. It's fairly, in my opinion, expensive. It's like, I think the minimum is about $200 a month. And then you get, the pricing is per user who accesses the site, so. And this is my closing message here. So the better together is not just the apps, but it's also the people that are working in these different areas. So I feel like as a community could use more crossover between the different applications. So more interactions between Power Apps people and Power BI people, or Power BI people and SharePoint people. Like we can all work together to make cool stuff. And that way we don't have to be an expert at everything, you know what I mean? So more collaboration, I think, is a good goal here.
Agreed. The curiously on one thing from the last page that I wanted to bring up as a question is overall, like, what is your opinion on Power Pages and like its usability versus some of the other platforms? I've only poked around in it, but
yeah,
I built my webpage 9 years ago on Squarespace and have just slowly evolved it over time. But yeah, like what do you think its usability either is today or maybe going forward as it continues to get built out? My last little comment before anything is Microsoft's just really good at building a product, but they never really taking it all the way. Like Power Planner, it's kind of an example of something that's not super feature rich and could have been better.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good question because I was going to ask the same thing. I was going to ask if anybody has ever used Power Pages in real life for a real production application and how that went, because I've played around with it too. It's gotten a lot better than it used to be. It's still not perfect, and it probably, if you want to get the most out of it, you need to know more on the coding side.
Yep.
But it's expensive, so um, so does anybody in this that's watching today, has anybody had a production site in Power Pages?
Yeah, feel free to drop a comment in the chat related to that. I'll say that just I think my takeaway for that is if almost in a way of like an evolution of a SharePoint site page. If you're building a page for something internal, like you're at Adobe, you're a Chevron, and you need a site page for something for your within the organization, I think Power Pages is useful for that. If you are like an independent consultant and you're building a website for yourself as like a one-stop shop for payments and like all that other stuff, the WordPresses and Squarespaces and all that are going to be more feature rich for like an actual public website versus more of a streamlined set of pages for within an organization, which I think is kind of somewhat of the target of Power Pages as well too, is like the internal websites to be used within intra-org rather than external org.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of hard because the Power Pages has come a long way, but it is still missing some things. So, I mean, it's really good for forms. Like you can collect form information. You could like say embed a Power Virtual Agent, like a chatbot on it, and that would be cool. And it's good for like basic information. But as far as setting up e-commerce, I don't know about that.
Yeah, agreed. A couple, yeah, there was a few people that mentioned that they had a couple clients who were using them, but they're also phasing the pages out.
Okay. Can they say why?
Yeah.
Like,
oh, that's a yeah, Bernard. If you actually have any clarification, would be curious. Daryl Lynch is just mentioning that if you have SharePoint, why do you need Power Pages? I mean, from my perspective, it's painful to build a SharePoint page. Power Pages is at least more clicky, draggy, droppy.
It's SharePoint is way easier than Power Pages. I totally
really okay. I mean,
yeah,
I haven't built a SharePoint page in years.
Oh
like a
yeah,
site page
then
back
you
with
really
the
should.
yeah. I used the classic builder.
Yeah, no, I feel like people have PTSD from classic SharePoint, and so they automatically like.
I mean, to be fair, like that is what I'm speaking from. Is like I've pretty much all the other stuff now. Like I don't. The only thing I use SharePoint for is all the repository that gets created with Teams every time you create a channel. And then it just creates the pages and everything automatically for that. But I haven't built a custom page in SharePoint in years. But it was more of the classic builder.
Better. Yeah,
okay,
the
well,
modern
that's
one
good
is
to hear.
really it's much easier.
Okay.
And from my perspective, the advantage of Power Pages is that it's accessible to anonymous users. So it is like a literal website. So anybody can visit it. They don't need a Microsoft account. Whereas SharePoint, you have to invite specific people with a Microsoft account in order to access the pages. So
okay, good to know. Yeah, I think that was it for the comments related to that. One last mention from Bernard, they were just, he mentioned the customer was ditching Dynamics and the other half of the organization is using Salesforce. There's just not a lot of need for it, I guess.
Okay.
It was more of a company transition rather than a fault of the product or the platform.
I feel like a lot of development work is going into Power Pages right now. I don't know if that's just my impression or if that's the truth, but I think it's going to be getting better.
And I'm sure Copilot's going to pop up in there where you're
like,
yes, you point it at the one lake repository of every file that you have for your company, and like, all right, this is my business. You can scan all the text and all the data. Make me a website that like represents my business, and I'm sure someday it will be able to get you like 70% of the way there.
Yeah, and they've got templates now, so you can one button click create something based off of their templates, and it's even got like some forms pre-configured. They do multi-page forms now too, so you can like make a whole application process where they enter stuff and then save and continue and that kind of thing. So, and they seem to use the model-driven app forms. So if you're familiar with model-driven apps, then you'd probably have a good time with it.
feel like those are recent, but those probably came out, what, 4 years ago at this point?
Something like that, yeah. They just completely overhauled model-driven apps not too long ago, so it's not as painful as it used to be. It's actually, like, supposedly easier than Canvas apps now.
Oh, very cool. Okay. All right. I think that was everything then on Power Pages, at least. Thanks for coming back to that very
Yeah.
cool discussion.
Yep, and that was the end of my slides, so
Beautiful. I think there is, I kind of have some closing questions for you. Like, what are some of your overall favorite integrations of like BI with other stuff as some of the most useful things that if everyone was to like to leave here today and go explore one or two integrations that Power BI can have with other products in the Microsoft platform, what would you recommend that they look into first?
so I'm a SharePoint person, so obviously I tend to gravitate towards using SharePoint with it, just as my default. Like it's a really good stopgap thing for closing the holes in all of the different other tools that you have. So Power Automate is pretty cool too. So the ability to put stuff into your email is cool because that's something that a lot of people used to do with SSIS that there's not a really great replacement for in Microsoft 365. So I feel like that has some weight as well.
Okay. I think SharePoint certainly is often underutilized. But the other problem too is like SharePoint and OneDrive is so easy to throw around interchangeably because it's called OneDrive. It's hosted in SharePoint. The actual architecture is all SharePoint in the back end, but it anything Microsoft terminology can be very confusing.
Mm-hmm.
Power Query and Power BI get and transform in Excel, but I do think that leveraging that, especially just with your PBX files, as we've already showed, like that is at a absolute bare minimum, please have your file somewhere with version history and stop naming your file underscore 7.21,
Yeah.
7.22, because then you
Yeah.
lose the lineage
Yeah.
with that. You already have the built-in version history. You do not like, outside of maybe having a couple separate files between like dev, prod, test, which is okay. Stop, having the underscore final, underscore final, final, final. I still see clients constantly doing that, and it's really hard to retrain that muscle for people. Like they don't trust the platform to maintain proper history, and they think they can do it better just by renaming the files and putting it in folders.
Yeah, and I guess if you're trying to make like discrete intentional versions, you
Mhm.
could argue that, but the check-in checkout I feel like is a better way to do that. And by the way, the check-in checkout is just it's in the same menu in here. I don't think you can do it locally, so you have to go into SharePoint to do it, but the checkout is where is it? Under more? There it is. It's under the more menu, so you can check out and then check it back in the same way. And when you check in is when it gets the version oh, I have it open, so it's not letting me check it.
No worries.
All right, but that's where the comment pops up, so you can type in your version comment.
I also just submitted a response to your thing too.
Cool. Yeah, so our forms of response, let me refresh this.
There we go.
All right, so looks like a lot of people use SharePoint as the app that they do better
No dog
together with.
lovers.
No,
No dog lovers.
there's one despising mammals, but it looks like you have to click view more to view this. Yeah, there we go.
I like that it wasn't animals, it's specifically mammals. Just in case. Yeah, like fish are cool, but no, mammals not so much.
Well, I mean, cats and dogs are mammals, right? That's where I was going
That's
with
fair.
that.
Yeah,
Like,
that's fair.
maybe
Okay.
snakes are your thing. I don't know.
There are definitely reptile pet people.
For sure.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I used to build these in Power BI, so I do like that they have auto-generated visuals that now go with the responses, so you don't have to then export and extract it. Years ago, I built a demo file off one of those, and the one that I remember that was hard to parse when using the I think extracting the data out of it was either SharePoint or an Excel file, but the 1 to 5 star rating, I remember when connecting to it in Power Query was like a blob of JSON text or something like that. And actually getting the proper stars, then reconverting it back into a visual that actually had the average amount of stars, I do remember took quite a bit of time. Now it's super easy. But like V1 of forms that had all those form types, did not export easily to other data systems. Yeah, in terms of how it stored the data.
Yeah, I have issues with like the Likert scale questions still. Like the Likert scale
Hmm.
ones just they don't come through in the Excel file properly. And this is what the synced Excel file looks like, by the way.
Yep.
I've tested what happens if you change the questions or if you add new questions, it does actually like properly update the Excel file, which I didn't really expect, honestly. So that's
Oh,
cool.
that's good. Okay.
And this is the SharePoint location up here. So you would, if you were
Yep.
connecting to this, you'd take this chunk off the URL and
Butter toast.
yep, tenant. All
All
right.
right. See, if there's any questions left from any of the people tuning in, feel free to drop them into the chat down below. I see a comment from Not where he just mentioned that he, in a large organization that he worked, he never saw a proper data warehouse, but almost all Power BI projects were backed with files in SharePoint. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's probably 99% of your version control for most people, maybe 90%, but it's pretty much going to be SharePoint, which is not bad. It's just not enterprise scaled. Not nearly as many people have wanted to pursue Git because it's been so much more complicated. Thankfully, the complexity bar is lowering a lot now that workspaces have an option to just connect, to Azure DevOps. I do know that their pipeline is to eventually add GitHub, but I do think that that threshold is going to be lowered, and a lot more small businesses, which don't have like dedicated tech people, will be able to start using more Git type version control as it gets easier and less complicated to use. Go ahead and switch back to our screen here. Yeah, so that I think your one question was mentioning on SharePoint. I wanted to just add one comment on that, on one other integration that I personally love from a reporting perspective is the PowerPoint integration. I love the
Mm-hmm.
embedded PowerPoints where you can have a slide, immediately interact with a report, go on to your next slide. It's one of my favorite features built in as another Office product. But one other takeaway from you that I would be curious on is what is an upcoming feature that you're aware of, or a product update of further integrations that's not out yet, but maybe that's on the roadmap that you're excited about?
That's a really good question. So a lot of the coverage of the upcoming features that I am in the loop on are around SharePoint specifically, not necessarily SharePoint and Power BI, but there's a whole lot of stuff coming down the pipe for SharePoint. So like they're going to do co-authoring and like brand center stuff and all that kind of thing, which probably most of this audience doesn't so much care about, but
Will
there's
this
a
be
lot of,
co-authoring for like a SharePoint site, or?
yeah, for pages. And they're going to do,
Oh, okay.
Microsoft Lists has a lot of stuff coming. So if you like SharePoint lists as a source, they're going to have more lightweight customization of what the form
Mm.
looks like, which is really the big weakness of SharePoint lists right now is you can't customize how the look and feel at all without going into Power Apps. So there's some stuff coming there, and like just SharePoint lists in general. They're calling it Microsoft Lists now because it's like it's
Yeah.
a product, but it's literally the same thing. But there's a lot of view configurations that they're doing that are looking really cool. So the list views are going to have like you can drag and drop pictures into the list view to add pictures to the records. And there's some cool stuff with like the scale ratings, like 1 to 5 stars that's coming, and just I think there's like a calendar view now and a Gantt view and all kinds of cool stuff that's happening with the list views. So I'm excited about that.
Okay, so it's good to know that SharePoint's getting a bit of love, especially considering I haven't been into it for a few years. So I think I almost need to take an opportunity for myself to step back into it and just go explore it a little bit. Because like I said, I'm dating myself with using the classic builder, and I'm sure it's come a long way since then. So
Yeah, that's where I started too, and I can definitely say that it is much better than it used to be. And people kind of cringe when you start mentioning SharePoint even now, but I feel like a lot of that is based on classic SharePoint experience. So
it's like that, or old school Visual Studio, like the jokes, like, oh yeah, like I'll go run some errands and I'll come back and it'll finally be open.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so any other takeaways that you have for people on learnings, next steps, or anything else that they kind of should explore as part of the overall Better Together ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that you should follow what you like generally. So give everything a try and see if you enjoy it. And if you do, then spend some time learning it and kind of integrating it in your work.
Absolutely. I think that's, yeah, go to where the passion is, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, Christine, I really appreciate you coming on today, sharing all the information that you have, and certainly kind of talking and walking through just the overall ecosystem of Microsoft. I think there's a lot of tools out there, and it's a great conversation, kind of breadth versus depth on any one of these particular subjects or things that you could potentially become an expert on. So very useful information. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing that today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And then for everyone who tuned in today, thank you so much for coming on to this. Recording, as always, will be available. And again, any resources for reaching out to Christine or just some of the information as well of anything she shared today and relevant links will be down in the video description. So feel free to check those out. But otherwise, Christine, have a great rest of your Friday, and everyone have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you so much for watching. Please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you want to help support this channel, take a look at our channel memberships or our merchandise store for cool swag. And last but not least, please consider sharing this video on your social media platform of choice to help our channel grow. So, until next time.